Peter, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Hi Lily, great to be here.
You are calling from Australia, aren't you?
Yep, it's 8 p.m. on a Wednesday evening here in Australia, and we're moving into summer here. And I think, as most people are aware, we've had a very good run with COVID. I think it's a combination of good luck and good management that it's getting back to normal in many of the states here in Australia. Which unfortunately is not the case in the Northern Hemisphere. And I've got a lot of friends in the UK, Europe and the US, and really heart goes out to everyone with these very difficult times.
Well, since we have mentioned COVID, since the very beginning of the lockdowns, fraud risk has been flagged as a rising concern for risk managers. But is it a new part of risk management?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question. I think that fraud's always been around in banks and financial services, whether it's application fraud or fraudulent transfer of monies. And it's been in the system for decades, if not centuries, in many respects. What we've seen, I think in the last 5 to 10 years is an acceleration of the types of fraud, particularly electronic fraud, and now, of course, it all merges with cyber security. And like many of the other things we've seen this year in 2020 and COVID, the trends have just accelerated at a very, very rapid pace. And I think I think for a lot of the fraud and financial crime teams in all of the banks, it's been a case of catching up with these new ways of really accessing money from banks. And that's the reason over the years that people go to the banks looking for money. It's where the money is. I think COVID has really presented a number of new challenges, really because of the point in time. We've seen a whole lot of new entrants into the broader payments space in the last couple of years. Certainly new ways of transacting outside the banking system and within the banking system as well. And the new entrants, coupled with, online shopping entrants and e-commerce entrants, has meant that the landscape, particularly around payments, has been far more complex now. And so, the rapid rise of e-commerce, driven by COVID, has really amplified the avenues in which fraud electronically can be undertaken.
So this is the impact of COVID-19, essentially. But how did that change financial crime in general? So has there been any more activities than usual?
Well, again, I think it's really a continuation of trends that have been amplified. Refinitiv, which is the former Thomson Reuters, they do I think it's an annual survey, and earlier this year, in March, survey of about 3,000 large companies around the world had reported a 79% increase in fraud on the previous year. So I think previous year, 48% of those surveyed had been subject to fraud. This year was 79%, and that was really effectively a pre-COVID survey. So that is very much fraud, white-collar crime. So you're seeing an increase before COVID. And to my earlier point, that the increased use of digital channels for everything, identification, opening of bank accounts, transacting on bank accounts, and just general participation in the digital economy, has, on one hand, it's meant that a lot of the old forms of fraud have probably dropped away a little bit, and even branch closures, for example. Many banks all around the world have closed branches, some temporarily, some permanently, as a result of COVID. So, the opportunity to perpetrate fraud through manual channels through the branches has sort of dropped away. But some of these new methods have seen an increase in fraud. And probably the other thing COVID has sort of driven, which happens every time we have an economic downturn, is you have rising unemployment, rising sort of financial distress in individuals and households, And that in turn, simply means that people are a little bit more desperate for money and turn to, criminal methods to gain money. So the economic downturn that's accompanied COVID in itself, is a driver of increased fraud activity.
So, of course, the criminals got more sophisticated, and so should the financial institutions, to combat the activities of financial criminals. But how could financial institutions evolve now?
Yeah, and again, also a very good question. I think one of the things which has been a byproduct of the concerted effort to improve AML CTF processes in all jurisdictions and all major and minor financial institutions. Obviously KYC is a key part of AML CTF programs, but KYC tools and methods in themselves has actually meant that it's becoming harder for customers to, fraudulently represent themselves as someone else. So there's sort of good news in that the real push to do digital identification, the access that many banks now have to, government data electronically has actually, again, reduced the incidence and opportunity of fraud in one channel, because there is, significantly more investment being made in monitoring transactions, identifying customers digitally, and making sure that the banks are actually dealing with the customer themselves. I think also, advances in authentication for transactions. Many, again, minor and major financial institutions now implement multi-factor authentication. That's having a big impact on reducing, and if not eliminating fraud that would have taken place 4 or 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago in the early days of internet banking.
One last question. Obviously, we've been talking about technology a lot here in relation to fraud and how activities have changed. And technology risk is now becoming a really big part of risk management. How does fraud and technology risk sort of interlink with other risks?
Yeah, I think, technology at the end of the day is an enabler to help, be it business managers or risk managers do their jobs more effectively. I think there's really a blend needed of, and it's really that question about where cybersecurity sits, because essentially it's actually using, very tech-heavy methods to protect institutions from cyber threats. I think it's a matter of harnessing, sort of traditional, be it physical security, fraud skills and techniques, or not even a lot. I think most banks now have ex-law enforcement agency personnel working in their fraud teams or cybersecurity teams. It's really having a strategy, having a coordinated approach, making sure you're not solely reliant on technology. A big part of this is making sure that you've got robust processes, making sure you've got, really the 3 lines of defence, fully working, and also each of those 3 lines having the tools, and it is predominantly technology and data analytics tools, to make sure you can identify anomalies and give yourself a fighting chance to, keep fraud down to a minimum.
Peter, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Lily, and best wishes for the season as well.